Today we'll be looking at the solid, dependable workhorse of the Guard, the Chimera. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy and tactics focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. In today's video we'll be continuing our look at the datasheets in the Astra Militarum Codex, and how we can best employ them in 8th edition 40k. Today's video takes us to the Chimera, the rugged APC, that allows us to deliver a mechanized infantry punch with our Imperial Guardsmen. In this video we'll take a look at its datasheet, any obvious buffs, synergies and stratagems on the table, and how I would run them as part of an Imperial Guard army. In the background, the Chimera is the Imperial Guard's most commonly used armoured troop carrier. It's flexible, durable and practical, packing a relatively large amount of fire support for a troop transport. Infantry squads in Chimeras are often referred to as armoured fist units within the Imperial Guard, and these slightly more elite units are deployed in attachment to Imperial Guard regiments to provide some mobile and reactive counterpunch to an otherwise slow-moving infantry formation. The Chimera chassis is incredibly flexible and is the basis for many of the Imperial Guard's artillery pieces and fire support units. One significant advantage of the Chimera troop transport is that it can cope very well in amphibious conditions, and many an enemy has been surprised by Chimeras crossing what they deemed to be an impassable river. So let's see what the transport can do on the table. So the Chimera is a dedicated transport for Codex Astra Militarum, with its standard fairly ubiquitous profile. It has a movement of 12 inches, weapon skill 6+, ballistic skill 4+, strength 6, toughness 7, 10 wounds, 3 attacks, leadership 7 and a 3-up save. It degrades in the normal way. When it's 5 wounds or less it'll hit on 5s, and when it's on 1 or 2 it'll hit on 6s and only move 4 inches. At base, the Chimera is armed with a multi-laser, a heavy bolter and 2 lasgun arrays, and to field 1 for your troops will be 73 points. We're all well aware what heavy bolters and multi-lasers do, but the lasgun rays are a bit more unique. They're 24 inches rapid fire 3 weapons, with the profile of a lasgun, strength 3, AP nothing, damage 1, and they can only be fired if there is a unit embarked within the vehicle. Though there's no stipulation in what sort of unit that can be. It could just be one astropath, and he'd still somehow be able to fire all of the lasguns. Probably some sort of crafty psychic shenanigans going on there. It can trade its multi-laser for a heavy bolter for an additional 3 points. I'd say that the two are fairly well balanced. The heavy bolter is certainly more useful, as an extra point of AP is almost always more useful than going from strength 5 to strength 6, but it does cost a few extra points, so I could very much see you either taking or leaving this upgrade. You can also replace either the multi-laser or the heavy bolter with a heavy flamer. These ones are a fair bit more expensive. A Chimera with 2 heavy flamers will cost you 88 points, so a fair bit more pricey. Heavy flamers aren't such a bad pick on a Chimera compared with some other places, as they're likely to be tanks that you don't care too much if they're locked up in close combat, and they can be quite often just thrown forward at the enemy, where they can be a bit of a disruptive influence, burning some infantry to death, and being a little bit harder to charge because of their high overwatch. That being said, it does make them a fair bit more expensive than the cheapest version, which is a significant factor on a tank that you mainly want to be keeping cheap, as its main job is being an inexpensive barrier to keep the squad inside it safe. The flamers will of course be best in things like Cast-Chan, where you can re-roll the number of shots. Finally, you can take options from the vehicle equipment list: the auger array, which isn't very good, the track guards, which are somewhat expensive on a Chimera, but on a flamer version could keep it functional and mobile until it actually bites the dust, and the dozer blade, which is unfortunately thoroughly underwhelming. As a vehicle, it explodes in the normal way on a 6 when it dies, and it also has the option of smoke launchers, which are a lot more of a factor in consideration on the Chimera, because it's not quite as big a deal if you forgo its mediocre firepower, and often it really wants to stay safe to keep the troops inside it alive. Talking of its transport capacity, it can carry 12 Astra Militarum infantry. Each heavy weapon team takes up 2 spaces, and each Ogrin takes up the space of 3 other models. Being transport capacity 12 is particularly handy. It means that you can fit in an infantry or veteran squad and still have space for officers or psychers, or it means you could fit 2 special weapon squads in the same tank, so that is a nice extra perk. So overall, the Chimera is a fairly cheap Imperial Guard vehicle with mediocre firepower but a pretty decent defensive profile, at least point for point, whose main aim is to use its transport capacity to keep units safe and get them to the front to engage the enemy on our terms. In terms of ways to buff and improve the Chimera, there are of course the regiment traits. Cadian reroll 1s isn't terrible, but you only get that if you stand still, and generally Chimeras are mostly going to want to move to actually transport units from A to B. Cast-Chan, as we mentioned, has some synergy with the Chimera's flamers. Armageddon Steel Legion can increase their durability against AP-1 weapons, and they also have their unique order mount up, allowing a unit to get back in the Chimera after they've fired, which can certainly be handy for keeping some fragile weapons safe. Talon is one of the best regiments for mechanised infantry, as it means that the Chimeras can move and still hit everyone on 4s with their heavy weapons, so it's usually going to be worth upgrading to the heavy bolters on this one. For me, these are the strongest, but the others also have their bonuses: Mordians with their 5+ Overwatch, Vostruans with their longer range, and Valhallans with their slower degrading. In terms of custom regiments, the jury-rigged repairs option is probably the strongest for Chimeras, as who doesn't like durable tanks that repair themselves over the course of the game. Chimera and mechanised infantry have their own Vigilist formation, the Emperor's Blade Assault Company, which you can buy in for 1 command point. This affects your commanders, command squads, special weapon squads, veterans, infantry squads, chimeras and Tauroxes. They have a warlord trait that can allow you to issue orders from inside a chimera, provided the other unit has a Voxcaster, and they have a mechanised fire support stratagem for 1 command point to allow a chimera to overwatch on a 4+ against an inbound unit that's charging one of your nearby infantry squads. Finally, for another command point, the rapid redeploy stratagem can allow an Emperor's Blade unit within the chimera to get out after the chimera has moved. This can be pretty handy for zooming your chimera all the way up the board, and then getting out a threatening unit to hose down the enemy with some unexpected special weapons fire or something. I believe from the way that the stratagems word it, that the chimera can also advance before doing this, meaning that you could put a squad a really long way from where the chimera is, ensuring that your opponents are not safe. In terms of character support, chimeras can certainly profit from nearby Tech Priest engine seer repairs, if there happens to be one around, though compared with other more valuable tanks they are probably a less high priority to repair. If a chimera also happens to be in the way of the enemy, you might want to put Night Shroud and Psychic Barrier on it from your psychic powers, to make it a real obstacle for the enemy to deal with, particularly if you pop smoke at the same time. In terms of other stratagems that chimeras have available, Crush Them is an option to hit on 2s when you're in close combat that, as I always say, is best used to finish off that last enemy infantry model in close combat to allow you to shoot next turn, if it has the chance of making that difference. Jury Rigging can be used to regain a wound, usually best when you're going from one bracket to another, so it might make the difference between hitting on 5s and hitting on 4s, for example. Chimeras have the Mobile Command Vehicle stratagem that allows a friendly officer to issue an order from within the chimera. Again, you need Voxcasters to be around for this, so it's not particularly helpful. Honestly, in general, officers are so cheap that you may as well just have them outside the commander and not bother buying the Voxes. Defensive gunners could surprise the opponent with a little bit more overwatch, though the Chimera's guns aren't the most threatening in the world compared with our other tanks. And finally, from the new Psychic Awakening book, we have Head First, which is an interesting stratagem for making an infantry unit +2 to charge when they jump out of a Chimera to charge. I guess it could be potentially helpful if you're thinking about tying up some enemy close combat assets, particularly combined with that other stratagem that you can use from the Emperor's Blade Company to move them and get them out of the Chimera afterwards. But honestly, it's not the most overwhelming thing in the world. It's only a small buff to charge, and guard melee is generally quite weak. On the whole, I would rarely use stratagems on chimeras, though it's always worth bearing them in mind for niche situations. So overall, the biggest question is what to put in the chimera, and how many of them to use in your army. Now, a mechanised guard army list can be quite an interesting and slightly annoying threat for your opponent to face. Until they can crack the tanks, their anti-infantry units will be pretty underwhelming. So having a chimera full of infantry on an objective really does make it kind of annoying to shift. In general, I'd say you are paying a premium to have the chimeras about, so it's generally going to be worth including at least something that has a sting inside of each one when your guard force disembarks to put some rapid fire rounds into the enemy. I'd say some of the optimal things to put in them are maybe veteran squads with 3 plasma guns, and special weapon or command squads also with plasma guns or other scary special weapons. It's absolutely worth thinking about putting some character support in along with them, particularly officers to give orders when they disembark, or maybe some astropaths for removing cover and psychic support. You can certainly put infantry squads themselves in chimeras as well. Again, I'd be a fan of the plasma gun and a bolter on the sergeant in this case, as by putting them in the chimera does make it a little bit more likely that they are going to be able to get out and have at least one good rapid fire at the enemy before they get to counterattack. I'd say one of the main aims if you are using a lot of mechanised infantry in your force is to try to deny your opponent the ability to take out your infantry bit by bit. In an ideal world, you probably want to have everyone in chimeras turn 1 moving up, then have a mass disembarkation turn 2 and get everyone first rank firing or taking aim with plasma guns into the foe. The threat range that an infantry squad has out of a Chimera is actually pretty massive, particularly if you also have access to orders such as Forwards for the Emperor, where they could advance out of the Chimera, which could be anything up to 15 inches worth of movement and then still shoot, or if you're playing Talon, which could do the exact same effect. Anyone who you could issue move to out of a Chimera as well could easily threaten even opponents' backfield objectives if you start in the midfield. If you are using multiple Chimeras, I would absolutely certainly use the Emperor's Blade Assault Company as the stratagem for moving the Chimera and then getting out of it afterwards. It's a really helpful special rule for getting in range of your intended targets. If I was deploying such a force on the board, I'd be wanting to be fairly aggressive with it, provided I wasn't trying to outrange enemy assault threats or anything. Naturally trying to take any cover saves that I could, but to be honest, if your opponent's shooting your Chimeras rather than your more valuable tanks and artillery, then it's not the worst thing in the world. If you're using a big mechanised list, I'd certainly be considering prepared positions in matchups where it's going to count, as having all of your tanks have a 2-up armour save for a turn is well worth 2 command points in most circumstances. Depending on how fast the enemy is coming to you, I'd usually move up turn 1 and take what pot shots I could with the Chimeras, or maybe think about popping smoke if you're worried about decent shooting reprisals. Then aim to get out turn 2, order everyone, make any assaults where possible to either gum up the enemy or fight hand to hand with other similar light infantry, and from there try and use the Chimera to be a disruption and distraction type unit, parking itself on objectives, targeting enemy units so they have to fall back, and generally being a massive nuisance. If you have any surviving infantry after that wave has gone in, don't forget that you can think about getting back in the Chimera if the shooting isn't going to be a big deal, as it could mean that your infantry unit gets some free movement out of it, or at least gives your opponents more of a target priority headache, as they can't just remove them with light anti-infantry firepower without committing some anti-tank firepower to get through the Chimera first. Overall, I think that the mech vets or mech infantry approach probably isn't the strongest that we have to play with in the Guard at the moment, unfortunately, but it is a really fun strategy and trying to make it work can be a good challenge. If things go well, it can certainly surprise a opponent who hasn't seen it work before. I'd certainly not be going 100% Chimeras with it. I'd want to back it up with other big threats such as tanks and artillery to mess with the opponent's priority as to what they want to shoot first. Of course, the main contender for the Chimera is the Taurox, which is very slightly cheaper with just 2 autocannons, but a bit weaker to mid-strength firepower, only being toughness 6 rather than toughness 7. I think that the two are fairly well balanced on the whole, and they both have their different advantages. At some point we might do a direct comparison between the two, weighing up the numbers, but I think we'll leave it there for this video. If you've got any tips or tricks for using Chimeras or mechanised infantry on your Guard force, please let us know down in the comments below to help out other players. And feel free to subscribe if you'd like to see more Guard content every couple of days. If you'd like to support the channel, I do have a Patreon page, which allows these videos to keep on coming. So if you're enjoying the content, anything that you can spare in support is certainly appreciated. There are also a few other bonuses, such as early videos, voting on what sort of things you'd like to see next on the channel, and the occasional prize giveaway too. So if any of that would interest you, the link is down in the description. Finally, I'd like to say a big thank you for listening. I'll hope to see you guys next time.